This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
We were hoping not to have to be here today. Last year when we put down the kinnos, we were hoping that would be for the very last time. Some Jews even have a custom that they put their kinnos into the shemus box, hoping that Mashiach would come and we would not have to use the kinnos another year. But here we are again. Avar Katzir Kol HaKayetz V'anachnu Lo Noishanu. We're here again, yet another Tisha B'Av. So this year in preparing the kinnos for Tisha B'Av, I was bothered by the following question. The last 10 kinnos that we recite on Tisha B'Av are known as the Tzion kinnos. Each one of the last 10 kinnos all begin with the word Tzion, with the exception of Kinna Mem Aleph. All of these 10 kinnos discuss the theme and the fundamental principle that Eretz Yisrael is the chosen land of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the center of the universe. But upon further examination, I was troubled by the fact that these last 10 supposed kinnos are not kinnos at all. They're not elegies, they're not lamentation. They're an expression of yearning and longing for Eretz Yisrael, extolling the grandeur and the majesty of Eretz Yisrael. But in what way are they kinnos in the traditional sense? They're not mournful, they're not morose, they're not sad. So for example, in Kina Lamed Vav, the Kina written by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, Tzion Haloi Sishali, where the Kina describes Sham Hashchina Shechuna Lachvir, the Shechina resides, V'yotzrech Pasach Lamo Sharei Shachak Sha'arayach, and how the Rebbeinu Shalom opened up opposite Yerushalayim, the gates of heaven. In other words, when you pray in Yerushalayim, your tefillos go straight up to Shamayim. In what way is this a kinna? This is extolling the majesty of Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi continues, Evchar lenavshi lehishtapech b'makom esharuach alakim shvucha al b'chiroyach. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi describes how he would choose to pray in the land of Israel, where God has already established the divine lines of communication, where the Rebbe Shem has already established that this is a place that He connects to Basar V'Dam. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi says, Mi yitneini mishoitet b'makoymos asher niglu elakim l'chayzayich b'tzayroyach. If only I could drift and float in the places where the Rebbe Shem revealed Himself to the Nevi'im, to the prophets. Are these kinnos? How are they kinnos? I would describe them maybe as piyutim, as in fact Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was considered the greatest of all the paitanim. The Rashba writes in a tshuva Siman Taf Yud Ches that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was the greatest of all the paitanim. Maybe we should call it a pismoin, a tefillah. But how is it a kinna? You know, there have been many great pilgrims who risked their life and gave up all of their belongings to move to Eretz Yisrael. Many Rishonim expressed their great love for Eretz Yisrael, but even the Rambam, in all of the writings of the Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim, the Rambam only mentions the concept of Eretz Yisrael one time in the entire Moreh Nevuchim. The Chovos HaLevavos, Rabbi Achia ibn Pakuda, Chovos HaLevavos only mentions Eretz Yisrael. What? He doesn't even mention Eretz Yisrael, actually. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, on the other hand, not only is Eretz Yisrael a major dominant theme in the writings of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi describes Eretz Yisrael in a completely different vein. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi says, Miyasa li knafayim v'archik nedoid. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi says, if only the Rebbe Shem would make wings for me, and I would wander far away. Onid lebisrei levavi bein b'sayrayach. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is echoing the comments of Moshe Rabbeinu. When Moshe Rabbeinu was told that he would not be allowed entry into Eretz Yisrael, so Moshe Rabbeinu says, if I can't enter as a human being, let me at least enter as an animal. And if I can't enter as an animal, Moshe Rabbeinu says, at least let me enter Eretz Yisrael as a bird. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi then pens probably his most well-known expression. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi says, Chaye nefashos avir artzech. Where the air of Eretz Yisrael, says Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, is literally, has the life-giving powers to revivify and resuscitate the soul. This is a concept that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi expounds upon in the Kuzari. That the same way the physical body needs oxygen to thrive and to survive, says Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, the neshama requires the air of Eretz Yisrael to be vital. That living in Chutz La'aretz, it's almost as if we're asphyxiating because we don't have spiritual air to breathe. Chaye neshamois avir artzech. Are these kinos? Are they words of lament? Are they elegy? Maybe piyutim, maybe pizmoinim. Why does the kinos end with these 10 tzion kinos? And I believe that in order to understand the format and the order of the kinos, we need to go back to the very first Tisha B'Av in our history. When the Ribbon Shalom took Klal Yisrael out of Eretz Yisrael, he was not just saving a nation from slavery. He was not just rescuing us from torment. The Ribbon Shalom was submitting these people to a new process of creation. HaKadosh Baruch Hu took 70 Jews who later became 600,000 Jews. And He fashioned us into a new entity called Yisrael, where our collective soul was now inextricably bound, not only to the Torah, but to Eretz Yisrael. And then we got the report. And the spies came back with the evil report about Eretz Yisrael. And yes, al pi derech hateva, there was room to be cautious, to be hesitant, to be scared. But when we were makabel this report, when we accepted this bad report about Eretz Yisrael, the Maharal writes, this dramatically altered the essential nature of the Jew. What this did was, it ripped Eretz Yisrael out of the spiritual DNA of being a Yid. Not only did we accept the report, but the Maharal explains, Klal Yisrael cried. We shed bitter tears about having to go into Eretz Yisrael. That yanked Israel, that yanked the Holy Land out of the DNA of being a Jew. Our mission and our avodah and the objective of reciting the Kinnos, we're not just reliving our history. This is not just an exercise of commemoration and memorializing. The purpose of the recitation of the Kinnos is to reboot and to regain a new outlook and perspective to Eretz Yisrael. The objective of Kinnos is to reprogram the Jewish soul. That Eretz Yisrael is not something chas v'shalom we have antipathy for, but is once again part of the reality of our spiritual composition. And I believe this approach to Kinnos is illustrated and is expressed in the lifetimes of one of the great heroes of Klal Yisrael in the last century, the Kloisenberger Rebbe. Kloisenberger Rebbe, Rabbi Kusiel Yehuda Halberstam, was the son of Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Halberstam, the Avbezin of Rudnik. On his father's side, he was a great-grandson of the Divrei Chaim, and he was the son of the great-granddaughter of the Bnei Yissaschar. At 13 years old, the Kloisenberger Rebbe was recognized as a great genius. His father passes away when he's 14 years old, and he becomes already a Rav at the age of 14. He marries the daughter of the Atzei Chaim, Reb Chaim Tzvi Teitelbaum, and at age 21, he becomes the Rav in one of the most prestigious areas in Hungary, in Kloisenberg. This talk has no political motive. There's no agenda here. But let's just set the facts straight. The Admorim of Chasidus in the time, in the end of the 19th century, were unsupportive of Zionism. Those are the facts. But there was a difference in opinion between the Admorim in Poland and the Admorim in Hungary. In Poland, many Admorim supported a practical stance toward the establishment of the state. So, for example, the Rebbes of Radzin, of Sakhachov, of Ger, they favored a pragmatic cooperation with the secular, but not in Hungary. without getting into too many details, Hungary, they were completely unsupportive. In fact, that's how the Kloisenberger Rebbe got the job. In 1919, the Haredim seceded from the regular Orthodox umbrella organization, and because of that, they were able to appoint the Kloisenberger Rebbe as the Rebbe. But during the Holocaust, the Rebbe was part of a labor force that was ordered to clear out the remains of the Warsaw Ghetto, and the Rebbe experienced one of the most deadly of all the death marches. If I could describe just briefly what one of those death marches was like from Auschwitz to Dachau. One of the eyewitnesses writes, there are no words to describe the cruelties perpetrated against these 6,000 downtrodden souls, the Rebbe among them, who marched from Warsaw to Dachau. They were forced to cover 70 miles on foot. They were beaten. They had to march. They had to sprint like animals. They were whipped. They were beaten with metal pipes. The march was conducted in intense heat, in starvation, in dreadful thirst. They were not allowed to stop even for a moment, like we read in Eicha, Vayelchu b'loi koyach l'fnei roidev. When the march began, the prisoners leave the Warsaw area, and one of the camp commanders says, some of you look tired, some of you look worn out. If anybody needs a ride, if anybody doesn't have the energy to march, we have a van waiting for anybody who would like a ride. 240 of these prisoners were gullible, and they took the commander up on his offer, and they were shot immediately. So now we're down to about 5,700 marchers. The way the march started was that the Germans established that the quota per day is they needed to cover 21 miles a day on foot. The commander of the march and his assistants rode in cars and in bikes. Anyone who could not keep up was ran over immediately and then shot. Oh yeah, and they gave some food before the march started. Salty, moldy cheese, like we read in the Kinnos. By the way, this was the 8th day of Av. In the summer heat, with the sun beating down on them, and the dust kicked up by 6,000 prisoners marching, only made them more thirsty. As they marched, some of the farmers offered water, but the SS officers immediately kicked these farmers, beat these farmers. No one was allowed to drink. They had to march on further and further and further. Finally, it's Friday night. It's Tisha B'Av, a year like this year. That fateful morning, the inmates were woken with the instincts of a hunted animal to avoid being beaten by the capos. The SS officer said that today, the sun is so strong, we need to cover as much ground as possible before the sun reaches its height. They were forced to assume a very fast pace. The prisoners run with every last ounce of strength, carrying their bundles, but it's Shabbos and the Rebbe would not carry his bundle. So a chassid standing next to the Rebbe said, Rebbe, I will carry your bundle. Better that one person carry than that two people carry. But the Rebbe, that was a very daring move. And one of the guards caught the Rebbe unloading his bundle to the chassid sitting next to him, took out the butt of his revolver, banged the Rebbe over his head. The sun continued to beat down on these prisoners. Some of the survivors had a little bit of bread in their pockets. They tried to swallow the bread, but their throats were so parched. Their lips were encrusted in dirt from walking 21 miles on foot per day. Their esophagus was encrusted in dirt. They couldn't even get the bread down their esophagus. It was lodged in their throats. They were passing famous cities, famous villages, the city of Kutna, the city of Sakhachev, where my Elta Zayda was the last Rav of the city of Sakhachev. All of these cities were Judenrein, wiped out completely. There was not even one Jew. I had the privilege last summer to return to Sakhachev. Sachachav was Ir ve'ein b'Yisrael. Today in Sachachav, there's not one single Jew. There's one Jewish woman married to a guy in the holy city of Sachachav today. At this point, the line was dropping. People fell corpses. Their clothing was stuck to their body. Their mouths were full of dirt. The gravel was in their throats. People would ask the SS officer, shoot me! Relieve me of my suffering! But the Kloisenberger Rebbe marched on further, and not only did he marched barefoot. Because it was the 9th day of Av. It was Tisha B'Av. And in the Shulchan Aruch it says you can't wear shoes on Tisha B'Av. But the Rebbe was whispering to himself, Psukim of the Eicha. He was saying to himself the Kinnis. And at one point the guard said, Rabbi, what are you saying? And he pulled the Rebbe out of the line and he made the Rebbe walk on the gravel and the glass, and the Rebbe couldn't take it anymore. His only option was to somehow get out of the line. So he tries to sort of fall off the road into a pit, but he was spotted at the last second. The officer raises his gun, shoots at the Rebbe's hit. There's blood gushing out of his arm. The Rebbe made a quick calculation. The calculation was if he falls, if the SS officer sees that he's bleeding, he's going to finish him off. So the Rebbe grabs some moist leaves from off of a tree, bandages himself, darts back into the line and continues marching. July 29th, 1980, when the Kloisenberger Rebbe laid the cornerstone of the Sanzlan Yado Hospital, he relayed that at that moment when he was miraculously saved, he made a promise to God that if he ever comes out of this alive, he would build a medical center to save the lives of other Jews. By the way, at one point of time they were getting near a river and they saw puddles of water, and the Rebbe and one of his Hasidim, Mendel Wieder, they take a leaf off of the tree. The leaf was moist, and the Rebbe had the opportunity to drink after 3 days of not putting any water or food in his mouth, but the Rebbe would not drink because it was Tisha B'Av, even though it was a nidcha. And all he did was he moistened his lips and his tongue. Of the 6,000 prisoners who left Warsaw, less than 2,000 made it to Dachau. The Rebbe lost his wife and 9 children. But there's another promise that the Kloisenberger Rebbe made to the Ribbono Shel Olam on that death march. He promised the Ribbono Shel Olam that he was going to move to Eretz Yisrael. And in 1945, upon liberation, one of his Hasidim expressed surprise that the Rebbe was coming to America. He said, Rebbe, you're going to America? He said, I'm not going to America, I'm going to Eretz Yisrael via America. One of the Hasidim once asked the Rebbe, where does your love from Eretz Yisrael come from? You come from Hungary. He said, I'll tell you a little secret. I had a little sefer, a very controversial sefer. The name of the sefer is Koilel Ha'ivrim. It was a book that was penned by Rabbi Kiva Yosef Schlesinger, who already in the early part of the 19th century encouraged Charedim to leave Hungary and to go to Eretz Yisrael. The Kloisenberger Rebbe said, we made a big mistake, we didn't listen to him. Again, I would never say this, I'm not saying my own opinion. I'm telling you what the Kloisenberger Rebbe said. And I've heard my grandfather, Zol Gesundsein, he's a Talmud of Nachem Zemba, survivor of all the death camps. Kanayin Hari is 104 years old. I heard him say this many times. Said the Kloisenberger Rebbe, if we would have listened to Rav Schlesinger's advice, hundreds, thousands, probably millions of Jews' lives would have been saved in the Holocaust. You know why we didn't go to Eretz Yisrael, says the Kloisenberger Rebbe? Maisa Satan, we didn't go. Not my opinion. I'm just telling you the words of the Kloisenberger Rebbe. When the Rebbe made his first visit to Eretz Yisrael, he traveled there through London. He came to London for Shabbos. Shabbos afternoon, he gave a stirring speech about the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. The Rebbe denounced the fact that religious Jews were not interested in building up Eretz Yisrael. One of the leaders of the community, actually I found out that they're related to me, went over to the Rebbe. Rebbe, maybe your comments are going too far in support of the secular state. For a Rebbe, maybe this is not proper. Whereupon the Rebbe clearly enunciated a 180-degree switch in his attitude toward Eretz Yisrael. Said the Kloisenberg Rebbe, and this is in his official biography, the Lapid Eish. We religious Jews, we like to criticize, while the secular are busy building Eretz Yisrael. Says the Rebbe, I also used to curse them. When I used to say V'lam al Shinim, who do you think I had in mind? I had in mind the builders. But said the Rebbe, I realized none of my curses were effective. None of them did anything. They only got stronger and stronger. Said the Rebbe, I changed my hashkafa. Kloisenberger Rebbe said, from now on, I'm going to build Eretz Yisrael and let the secular curse me. Is kina memhe lamed vav tzion halois shali? It's a kina? It's not a kina. Is kina lamed ches tzion ateretz tzavi? Is it a kina? How is it mournful? It's not an elegy. It's not lamentation. Kina mem beis tzion sefiras pe'er. Are these kinois? These are not kinois. These are the purpose of kinois. The purpose of revisiting and reliving 2,000 years of Jewish history is to come to the attitude that the Kloisenberger Rebbe came to. Tzion halois seshali chaye neshamois avir artzech. Libi oimerli, my heart tells me that this is the secret of the format of the kinnos. That after reciting 35 kinnos about Jewish tragedy, the last 10 kinnos are trying to rectify what got us into the mess in the first place. And that is antipathy to Eretz Yisrael. The Maharal writes that the moment Klal Yisrael cried about Eretz Yisrael, they had all kinds of cheshbonos, b'derech hateva, why it's not good and it's not a makom gashmi and it's not a makom ruchni. But by crying about Eretz Yisrael, it ripped Eretz Yisrael out of the destiny of the Jewish people for 2,000 years. And I felt that I received an endorsement min Hashamayim when I read in the biography of the Kloisenberger Rebbe that when his plane took off from London to arrive in Eretz Yisrael, where he ultimately resided, all the Kloisenberger Rebbe could say are the following 4 expressions. Kino lamed vav, tzion halois shali. Kino lamed ches, tzion ateres tzavi. Kino mem, tzion yedidus yedid. Kino mem beis, tzion sefiras pe'er. Kloisenberger Rebbe was a trailblazer. He was very bold. He met with some of the early founders of the state. He actually met with Ben Gurion. And Ben Gurion asked him, Rebbe, holy rabbi, by the way, my grandfather, in 1945, when Eisenhower came to the DP camps, my grandfather was the Kloisenberger Rebbe's translator to Eisenhower. He said, Holy Rabbi, what does the state of Israel mean to you? As a Haredi, what does Israel mean to you? What do you foresee in the future of the state? The Rebbe said, worst case scenario, I could walk out of my house Shabbos morning wearing a tall shtramel with nobody saying anything, no fear of persecution. So Ben Gurion said, and best case scenario? Best case scenario, Ben Gurion said. Best case scenario, Ben Gurion, you'll be wearing a shtramel. So the Rebbe's Talmidim asked, should we move to Eretz Yisrael? Should we come? Different opinions, different shitas, different cheshbonos. So the Rebbe would say, the last king that was conquered before coming to Eretz Yisrael was Melech Cheshbon. Said the Kloisenberger Rebbe, that comes to teach that in order to get to Eretz Yisrael, you have to conquer Cheshbonos. No Cheshbonos. Boyu u'reshuas ha'aretz. Could it be that this is the format of the kinnos? After recounting with 35 kinnos, Jewish tragedy, for 2,000 years. We need to get back to that first Tisha B'Av in history, before we were boicha b'chiyah shachinam. I'll tell you an amazing thing. Kloisenberg Rebbe would see everything the opposite of the way people would look at things. You know, as they say, das Torah is hepach midas balabatim. 1967, when the Western Wall was liberated, Kloisenberg Rebbe spoke the first night of Slichos that year. He said, liberation of the Western Wall was perhaps the most painful moment in Jewish history. Here, 1 second, the Kloisenberg Rebbe is all into moving there. How is the liberation of the Western Wall the most painful moment? The Rebbe said as follows, and you could hear clips of this, you could hear recordings of this. It is not possible to hear this drasha of the Rebbe without breaking down. The Rebbe said there was a father who had a wayward son. The son was so depraved, so debased, the father banished the kid. And after years, the kid was wallowing outside of the palace. The king finally sent word to his son, you know what, before I go, you're invited back to a ruin 100 feet away from my house. You could stay there, but I don't want to see you and you don't look at me. That was the most painful moment of the son's life. Says the Kloisenberger Rebbe, yes, it's a great privilege to stand at the Kaisel HaMaravi, but there is no more painful spot in the world than to stand at a Churban knowing that the Rebbe Shalom is not yet ready to let us back into his house. I think this is the objective of the Kinnos. This is the objective of Tisha B'Av. We're not just here to remember Holocaust, to remember crusades, to remember Jewish tragedy. The Rebbeinu Shalom is trying to get us back where our feeling toward Eretz Yisrael is as expressed in the last 10 Kinnos. Chaye neshamois avir artzech. And if we're able to reboot and revamp our perspective to where Eretz Yisrael is part of the spiritual DNA of Klal Yisrael, then the Rebbe says, if it's part of the DNA of a Jew, it will become, very soon, part of the future destiny of Klal Yisrael. May we all be zeicha to see the Bias Ga'al Tzedek, the Binyan Yushalayim, V'achzor HaShechina L'Tzion B'mher V'yameinu. Amen.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.